welcome back to my channel. I'm Careena and I love to talk about all things storytelling. Today I'm going to be sharing some tips and tricks for what I think is one of the most fun and sometimes one of the most challenging parts of the early phases of creating a story, and that is finding names for your characters. I think we've all been there. We're starting to figure out who this character is. We've created some personality traits, we are developing a backstory, and we're starting to get really attached to them, but we just can't figure out what to refer to this character as. We just can't find a name. If that's you, if you've been struggling to find a name for your character for a while, hopefully the tips and tricks in this video will help you find something that you love. I'm going to be talking about where you can find names, how to choose a name, and then lastly I'm going to share some pitfalls that you can avoid that I have definitely fallen into before, so that way you can be confident in the name you choose and avoid some mistakes that I've made in the past. So first up, where do you find names? What are some resources that you can go to find some names for your characters so that you can start kind of browsing through and just figuring out what you like? So the first that I'm going to mention, I have a few favorites that I'm going to talk about, but the first one is just a Google search. If you know that you want a girl name that means water, you can just search in Safari or Google or whatever you're using, baby girl names that mean water, and it'll come up with all sorts of results for you. There's probably going to be a bunch of lists of names, and that can just be a really fun way to find a name for a specific meaning if you want the character's name to have a specific meaning. The other thing you can do is if you're working in a time period, if you write historical fiction like I'm actually writing a historical fiction novel for Camp NaNoWriMo, which I will be vlogging, so stay tuned for that. But if you're working in a time period, for example, you can just Google colonial names for girls or whatever, or Victorian names for baby boys. You can just Google or search, whatever, things like that. You can also just search baby names in a certain language if you know that you are working with a certain language, whether historically or just in your world building. Searching on the internet can at times be your best friend when it comes to finding baby names. So the next one is, I feel like, the one that maybe a lot of us are going to be more familiar with when it comes for searching for inspiration for writing stuff, and that's Pinterest. I mean, come on, Pinterest is amazing. We love Pinterest. Pinterest is so much fun. It can be kind of a time vacuum whenever we're supposed to be writing, ask me how I know, but it's fun, and it can be a great resource. So there are lots of beautiful baby names on Pinterest, and a lot of them are displayed on really pretty images. There are a few pitfalls you want to avoid when looking for names on Pinterest, but I'll get to those later, like I said. But I actually have a whole board with hundreds of baby names on Pinterest that way I can just scroll and kind of sort through the different names when I'm hunting a name for like a main character or something where I want something a little bit more unique. And that can be a really great way to find a name. It's one of my favorite ways to find a name. And if you want, I will link the board down below so you can kind of peruse and maybe start your own board, so that way you can just kind of have this pool of names that you can look through when you're hunting for a name. The last place that I look for baby names is maybe a slightly more obvious or slightly less obvious option depending on how you look at it, and that is go get a baby names book from the library. I have checked out multiple baby names books from the library. This is my favorite one from my local library. I actually checked it out just for making this video, and the reason that it's one of my favorites is because it has the pronunciations, and it also includes some alternate spellings, and alternate spellings can be very helpful, as we will be talking about later in this video. I love these because I can just flip through a whole bunch of gorgeous names, jot down the ones that I like. I usually will, when I'm kind of just hunting for a name in one of these types of books, I will usually kind of get out a piece of paper or an index card or whatever, and I'll write down the name, the language, and the meaning. Because a lot of times I'm looking for names that are all from the same language, and that way too, they will sound similar to each other if maybe I use one for a main character and then I can use the rest as kind of a pool to pull from for the side characters, if that makes any sense. But yes, I love these. I feel like these are way underestimated as a resource for finding names for characters, but I really like them, so I would definitely try that if you haven't already. Now that we know where to look, some ideas on where to look for finding names, now we come to some criteria that you can use to help you figure out what you're looking for, what you want for your character's name. What types of things can you use to narrow down to figure out what you're looking for in a name for your character? So I have a few different factors that I consider when I'm looking for a name, and I mentioned some of them briefly earlier in this video, but I'll just go over them real quick for you. So the first one, aesthetic. If you found the name that seems perfect, that has the perfect meaning, that has the perfect correlation to your world building or your historical setting, but you hate it, don't use it. Pick a name that sounds nice, pick a name that's pretty, that you love, pick a name that is nice to say, that rolls off the tongue, that's memorable for your readers. It doesn't have to be something really fancy for your readers to be able to remember it. In fact, we're going to talk later in this video about how you don't want anything too crazy or nobody's going to be able to pronounce it or remember it. But do pick something that you like, and do pick something that's pretty as well as functional within the story. So the next thing, which I touched on earlier, is language. Whether you are working in a historical setting or you are working in an original world, make sure, or at least in my case, I make sure, that the language works within the setting. Whenever I'm world building for an original land or area or whatever, what I most often do is I pick a language or kind of a group of languages that I want most of the names to sound like, because it fits with the aesthetic of the world building, and it just kind of ties everything together when, even though they are real names that come from real languages, the names all sound like they go together. And they sound like they're just a part of this world. For example, I kind of have a world that I'm creating just for fun. And in this world, I have a kingdom, and I decided that I wanted most of the names to have Asian or Polynesian type names. I wanted them to have roots in those types of cultures and languages. And so when I'm looking for names, I look for names that either sound like they come from one of those languages or do in fact come from one of those languages. If you're working in a more historical setting, or let's say you're working and your story takes place over in the Middle East, even if it's not historical, you want the names to be something that comes from that part of the world, something that they actually name their children in that part of the world. So regardless of whether it's actually taking place in the real world or it's taking place in a world you create, I think that the language can be monumental in helping you really cement that setting in the reader's mind. Even if the readers don't notice it, the consistency and the similarity of the sound of the names can really help it feel like you're kind of in this place in the story, if that makes any sense. So, kind of piggybacking off of the world building we just talked about, another factor you can consider is values and religions. Pretty much everywhere and every time in history, religion plays an important part. There's a reason that names like John, James, Peter, and Paul have been really popular throughout history, because people want to name their children after figures that are important to them or after values that are important to them. Names like charity or patience, names that have religious meaning or that have meaning with certain values have been popular all throughout history. And it's not just limited to the more European names. There are a lot of Arabic names, which I love Arabic names. I think they're absolutely beautiful. A lot of the Arabic names are related to, the Muslim faith, or, a lot of Sanskrit names are related to the Hindu faith. Regardless of where you're working or when you're working, religious names have always been popular because values and religions and beliefs have always been important to people. So that is something to consider. If your character maybe exhibits a certain trait, maybe you could pick a name that means something, even if it's not the exact word, even if you're not going to name your character Patience, because that can be a little cheesy if your character is really patient and they're called Patience and you make that like a point in the story. That can be a little cheesy. But if their name is something that isn't like, oh, that's just the word for that. If it's a name that means something that relates to their character or that is important to their culture or that is important to their family, that can be just something subtle, even if your reader doesn't know it. That's cool for me as a writer. I like to name my characters things that have some sort of meaning for who they are, or the backstory, or the culture. I tend to not end up using religious names for whatever reason. I tend to choose more the names that relate to values, but that can depend on what type of setting you're working in and the ramifications of your story. But it is something to consider, and I think it can be a lot of fun to figure out not just how your character, how you might name your character something that relates to part of who they are, but also what were the parents thinking of when they named the character? Why did they name them what they did when the character was a baby? That can be a fun one to think about too. So just these different things, even though maybe nobody else will know, can definitely help just make the name even more perfect. So the last one, which I've pretty much already explained, meaning. If the meaning relates to the character or to something they'll do in the story, that can just be a really fun thing for us writers to do, even though nobody else is going to know. But anyway, those are my tips for how to choose names. Now we're going to talk about some pitfalls to avoid. And these are kind of all things that I have done, that I've made these mistakes, that hopefully you can avoid. There are going to be times where you're like, oh yeah, this name just doesn't work after all, but these are definitely things that if you keep in mind, it can help make it a little bit smoother of a process. So the first thing is the one that I feel like I do the most, and it is, the name is too long and or it has too many syllables. If you have some like really long names, I'm just going to throw out some really long names for you, like Edelmira or Giovanni. There's not necessarily anything wrong with those names, but if you start having 3 characters that all have names with 3+ syllables, it's going to get tiring for your reader, not just to have to read those names, but to have to remember how to pronounce those names, and it's just going to be a lot harder for them to keep track of who's who. I try to stick to 1 or 2 syllables for my main character names. For example, in Free, the main characters are Leonard, Edward, and Ruth. Those are the main characters in the story, and you can see that they all have 2 syllables or less for their names. That doesn't mean you can't use long names, but you just want to be careful because they can get really clumsy really fast, and this brings us to the second pitfall you want to avoid, which is the names are hard to pronounce. I love unusual sounding names that sound a little bit unique or maybe even odd to us, kind of in this English-speaking world that I live in. So I like names that sound unusual to me. They're not something that I hear where I live. They're not something that is common in my country or whatever. I like names that come from different parts of the world. I think they're absolutely beautiful. But sometimes they can be difficult to pronounce, and they can also be very difficult for the people around me or my readers to pronounce. So you want to be careful of that. Regardless of what the native tongue of you and your readers is, you want to bear in mind that if it's something that's too unfamiliar to them, it can really take them out of the story as they try to figure it out, because there aren't pronunciation keys in novels. That's a great idea, but that's just not something that there is. And so you want to make sure that it's not something that's too unfamiliar for your readers, that they'll be taken out of the story trying to figure out how to pronounce this character's name every time they see it. Now, that isn't to say you can't use unusual names, and you can very much use unusual names. Just be certain that it's clear how they're pronounced in the spelling. This is part of why I love alternate spelling so much in the baby names books, because it shows me some other ways to spell things. For example, this is not a name that I have used, but it's a name that I did come across. There is a name that I believe is either Gaelic or Irish, one of the two, and this is how it's spelled. And it's pronounced Kiva. To me, as a person who does not speak the language that this comes from, I would never have guessed that this was pronounced Kiva. And this is a really cool name. It means gentle or dove or something like that. I stumbled upon it a couple years ago when I was looking for names because I thought I wanted to write a Viking story, and then that just didn't end up going anywhere. But you can respell this as Kiva, just like how it sounds and how we would spell it, based on how it sounds in my language, in English. This is more how we would spell it based on how we like to spell out our syllables and all the different sounds and things like that. I don't know if that makes any sense, but if you wanted to use this name in your story, but this spelling was too hard for you and your readers to pronounce, you could absolutely use this spelling instead, because it's still the same name and it's pronounced the same way, but it's easier for readers to understand. And honestly, I think this is a very memorable name, so I think it could be a great name for a character. It takes some trial and error to figure out how much is just too hard to pronounce and how much is just a cool name, and that's something that I've had to go through a lot of trial and error to do. I had a name that I was absolutely in love with for a character in a story that I was writing way back that I ended up kind of moving on from that story after working on it for a few years. But I found a name that I believe is the Polish version of Matthew, and this is how it's spelled, and it's pronounced Mateusz, and I thought it was just the cutest stinking name ever, and it seemed like the perfect name. I was actually going to name a baby dragon this. It just seemed like the absolute perfect name for a baby dragon. It's technically a pterodactyl, but we'll ignore that. But my brother, to this day, teases me because that isn't the most weird-looking spelling, but it's like, how would you pronounce that when you read it? And I feel like there might not necessarily be a good way to respell that without it looking really funny. So I ended up changing this baby dragon's name anyway because I ended up setting this in more of a Middle Eastern type of setting, and having a Polish name didn't really make sense anymore. But I love this name, but it's an example of a name that I had to let go because it just didn't work in the story, and honestly, it just probably wasn't fair to expect my readers to figure out how to pronounce this because, like me, most of them probably aren't familiar with the Polish language. So the last pitfall that you want to avoid that I'm going to talk about is associations. And I feel like this can happen to us regardless of how versed we are in pop culture. I feel like because I don't consider myself very versed in pop culture, it happens to me more. But I think it can happen to all of us. And I've talked about this on Instagram before, and I've had people that like are more familiar with like, you know, popular books and movies or whatever, but say this has still happened to them. And it is, you find a name for your character, you probably get 2 drafts into the story, and then you find out that this name or a very similar name is the main character in like, you know, a really popular TV series or a really popular novel series. And ask me how I know this. This has happened to me before. And it really stank because I already associated this name with this character. This actually happened to me in my Camp NaNoWriMo project. The very first time I ever did Camp NaNoWriMo, I wrote like 2 drafts of the story with a name that sounds very similar to a side character from Lord of the Rings. I was not super familiar. I'm still not super familiar with Lord of the Rings. I mean, I know, you know, a lot of the basic characters in the storyline, but I didn't know all the side characters, so how was I supposed to know that this was like one of the side characters? And every time a person read that name, they were going to think of that side character if they knew, you know, about Lord of the Rings and about the side characters. So that was frustrating. But it happens, and it's not something to feel like, you know, unintelligent about. It happens. You can't be familiar with every single character throughout all of history. So what I do, especially if it's a name from Pinterest, because I have found that Pinterest is usually the worst about having names that are already taken, if you will, is I will just run a Google search a lot of times, and I'll just type in, who is this person? And this is one of those things where sometimes you do have to weigh, because if there is a character in another story that has the same name, but it's completely unrelated, it's a completely different type of character, that's probably not something to worry about. You know, most of the time you're not dealing with something on a Lord of the Rings level, obviously. But you do want to be aware, and you know, if you run a Google search on a name, every time I found that somebody somewhere has that name, you know, there's an actress in India or whatever that has this name. There's a person in Britain that has this name, you know, an important political figure or whatever. I don't worry too much about that. I just avoid the big associations, or if your character has a name that's associated with a character that has maybe a certain connotation about them, even if it's not necessarily prominent of itself, maybe that name is kind of known as like kind of an evil sounding connotation, and that's not really what you're going for with your character. You just might want to be aware. And some of the baby names books actually have, not this one, but another one that I checked out, actually have where it will tell you, like, you know, there's a famous actor with this name, this is a character in this book series, this is a character in this Shakespearean play. You know, there are ways to just make sure, you know, you're not naming your character after Romeo and Juliet or whatever. You know what I mean? You want to be aware of name associations. There are going to be times where you just stumble upon something and you're like, oh wait, this character's name exists in this other thing, and I really don't want the 2 to be associated, so I think I'm just going to pick a different name. It's not the end of the world. It's not something you need to panic about. It's not something you need to lose sleep over. But it's something that I've learned the hard way you at least want to have in mind and just kind of check sometimes just to make sure. I hope that this video has been helpful. It's actually a remake of one of my first ever videos. I just decided it needed an updated version with some fresh advice, as well as some of these tips on how to avoid pitfalls, because in that first video I was still kind of falling into a lot of these traps of, you know, this name is just a little too hard to pronounce, or this name is kind of already taken, and I thought it would be fun to share with you guys some of the things that I've learned through trial and error about naming characters. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe so you can stick around for more of my writing adventures. I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye!